Welcome back everyone. It's been a little while. Sorry about that, as usual, life gets in the way. So hopefully you've seen my last video where I started trying to transfer this famous Pink Floyd design onto my guitar neck. And hopefully you recall, I used these little thin strips of plastic bonded together in order to try and do that. The next part is going to be the tricky part, which is to try and get this green heartbeat design into the neck. Now, I've had a lot of thoughts on how I could go about doing this, and the end result could be achieved one of two ways. I either A, need to take some of this same plastic and effectively bend it into shape or cut the shape out of the plastic to inlay onto the design that I've already done, or I could go about filling it with some kind of coloured epoxy. Either of those are completely viable, but regardless of how I actually end up inlaying, I still need a channel to put the inlay in. And that really is the scary bit, because there's not really a good way to go about this. I did think about making templates. Templates wouldn't be a bad idea, but I've generally found throughout this build that every time I've gone out my way to make templates, I've spent a long time doing it. They haven't really worked as well as I'd hoped they work, with the exception of routing. And it's just generally not been worth it. So I've decided that I'm going to hold my breath and try and actually carve the heartbeat design into the neck by hand, pretty much freehand. You can hopefully already see that I've drawn the heartbeat on in pencil. And my plan is to effectively Dremel that out. Something I've never done before. Something which I think is going to be quite difficult. And if it looks terrible, there's not really a lot I can do about it. Speaking of looking terrible, I'm really going to have to concentrate on trying to carve this out, so the camera angles probably aren't going to be great, so I do apologise for that, but I will stop the camera and show you how I'm getting on along the way. I don't know how well the camera's going to pick this up, but I've just done the straight bit up to the point where the wavy lines start coming in. It's going to be less obvious when I'm doing the wavy lines by freehand, hopefully, but the straight line I would suspect would be the worst bit, and looking at it there, it's not too bad. Fairly tight fit for the plastic, which is good. Might have a little bit of a kind of raggedy edge right on it, but it's about the best I can do, really. Not as bad as it could be. Just tip the camera up there so you can just about see on top there. It's not bad at all. So hopefully you can see my actual following of the lines is pretty bad. Well, at least in terms of trying to keep the straight bit straight. But on the actual heartbeat itself, I think I can get away with that as sort of artistic license. It looks like a heartbeat, so it's okay. Well, sorry you didn't have a great view while I was doing that, but there really was no other way. But here is the finished result. Now, I'm not sure how I feel about it, to be honest. It could have never have gone well, but from a distance, actually, even though it looks like it's been drawn quite freehand, that's actually not too bad. I certainly know now that my idea of bending this plastic into shape to go around there, I just don't think it's going to work. I had planned to sort of heat it up with a heat gun, at which point it will become quite malleable and I would be able to get it in there. But I just think, yes, I'll be able to get it in there, but there's going to be gaps around it and everything. certainly on the points where it's in the ebony, dust and glue would fill up any little gaps or anything like that. But when it comes to the plastic, there's just no good way to take care of any little gaps or anything like that. So I think I've decided I'm definitely going to fill all of this with epoxy, which should be fun. That means I now have to stop recording and go and purchase some dye for my epoxy, which means you're going to have to wait even longer for this video. Oh well. So before we go any further with the neck, I need to do some experimentation. In hindsight, the normal way that you'd actually inlay anything really is to construct the inlay first and then go about cutting out a hole to put the inlay into. In this sense, I'm doing things a little bit differently in that I'm actually trying to fill cavities with resin. Now, other than the epoxy I used to stick this rainbow down, I've never really used epoxy resin before, so I definitely need to do some experimentation. I've ordered some, well, I was going to call it unbranded. It does have a brand. I have absolutely no idea whether it's a reputable brand or not of epoxy. It was pretty much the cheapest thing going on Amazon that looked like it was at least supplied from within the UK. And then I also went on a different site, which I think was resonate.co.uk, and bought some super concentrated opaque pigments to play with. So there's nothing really special about this epoxy. It's generally marketed to people who are making jewellery and things like that. I think it's fairly thin in terms of viscosity. It's 1-to-1 mix. The temperature in this room is probably about as low as you'd possibly want to go when making something with epoxy. But at the same time, it's not like I'm doing a river table casting or something like that. So I think I'm going to be okay. It's about a 40-minute work time and it's about a 24-hour cure time. So what I've done is basically carved out just some random shapes with the Dremel on this scrap piece of wood. I have radiused it as well, because the main concern I have is, other than actually getting the epoxy mix right, is I'm worried that because it's already radiused, I might not actually be able to fill all the way up to the top of the groove that I've put in my fretboard. The meniscus may hold it, it may get high enough, I don't know. So because of that, what I'm going to do, I'm going to try filling one shape just straight up with the resin, and for the other pieces I'm actually going to try covering them with sort of plasticky masking tape, the stuff that I normally use, leaving only a little bit at the top exposed and filling that kind of like a cast, and we'll see if that works and also if the tape sticks to the epoxy too well. We shall see. So it's all about experimentation. I guess there's nothing really left for me to do other than mix up some epoxy. So I've got two little mixing cups that are marked on the side. I do believe getting the ratio correct is very, very important when it comes to epoxy. If you get it wrong, it means it won't set properly. So I'm going to mix up 20 ml of each liquid. And move over to the pigment. Now, I'm expecting, from what I've seen on YouTube, this stuff to be ridiculously powerful. You should need only a tiny, tiny amount. Let's see if that's true. So I've literally just got the point of the knife coated in that pigment. And I'm going to dunk that in there, see what we get. There we go. So that's looking very opaque, exactly how we want it. I suspect I probably even used too much pigment there. That was more than enough. Now, while it's still workable, I'm actually going to try and get some of it into these little disposable bottles I normally use for super glue. Put this top on. And hopefully the epoxy will flow out of that, but before we try and apply it, I shall do the aforementioned, this tip. Really only intentionally trying to burnish it around the edges. So it forms a little bubble. Start with the uncovered piece. I can already see a problem in that the epoxy is quite thick. I'm going to struggle to get it down in those holes. It's nowhere near as liquid as I thought it was going to be. Trying to sort of inject it in there. I think maybe the point that I've cut on the tip here might be a little bit too fat. I should have gone a little bit thinner with it. It will force through a smaller applicator. In fact, let me try that. Right, super glue applicator tip. Let's see how that works. Coming out a little slowly. I'm going to cut it a little bit higher up. There we go, that looks perfect. So I can get that down in the slot and really inject it in, because the epoxy is sinking down over time, so I don't want to fill it up and then find I come back later when it's sunk lower. What is good is I think the meniscus is more or less holding it, so I might not need the tape, but let's try it anyway. I can see it filling up behind the tape there, which is great. Okay. I think I probably plastered that on about as much as I can. I'm going to give it maybe 10 minutes, then I'll re-examine it and see if there's anywhere looks like it needs topping up. So it's been about 10-15 minutes and I can see it dipping below the level of the wood. So I'm just going to try and top it up a little bit. So you can see there, that's had probably about an hour now actually, and the resin that I've got left is still fairly fairly liquid. You can tell that it's starting to go kind of syrupy, but it's, you know, it's not setting too quick. And as I said, it is fairly cool in here, so that might slow things down. But you can see the example without the tape on has burst out of the, for want of a better word, mould. It hasn't actually ran down the sides, which is great. But yeah, as I thought, the fact that the fretboard's radiused is going to be a problem in that respect. The tape, however, where I've burnished around it there, seems to be doing a fantastic job. I think we're definitely on to a winner there if that's looking as I hope it looks underneath. So I'm going to take that home where it's a little bit warmer. I'm going to just leave it in a nice warm kitchen overnight, and hopefully we shall come back tomorrow, remove this tape. We'll see if the tape sticks or whether I actually have to sand through the tape, and yeah, see what we're left with. One thing I have to say though is I am quite happy with the opacity. As you saw, I only really used a little bit of this dye. In fact, if anything, I probably used a little bit too much, and it is very opaque. I can just about see through where it's spilled out over the edges of the for want of a better word, mould. I can just about see the wood underneath, but where it's nice and thick, it is nice and opaque, which is great. So yeah, alright then, well, let's pick this back up tomorrow. Okay, so we've allowed that little experiment to cure overnight. Actually, it's been a few days, but it did set fairly quickly. I'll just give you a little close-up to show you what's happened. So you should be able to see there that, as I should have expected really, there's definitely no hope of a sort of meniscus holding to allow that to kind of set above the actual line of the wood. Therefore, if I was going to just do it like that, I would have to effectively sand back to the level of the epoxy, which I really don't want to do on my fretboard. If I look at where I used the tape and allowed it to kind of bubble up, that actually seems to have done the job. Let me just remove the tip. The tape's stuck a little bit, but you should hopefully be able to see there that allowing that to bubble up over the top of the groove has worked. It just means I'd have a hell of a lot more work involved in actually filing that back. But I think that's what I'm going to have to do, unfortunately, because as usual, I've done things in the wrong order. Do as I say, not as I do. So I've actually spent a little bit of time off camera there, just tweaking a few little areas where we had damage. If I can get a pointing implement, some of these points in various places, this one in particular, this big one here, actually came off with the Dremel. This black stuff here as well did. So I've spent a little bit of time just chiseling out some replacement pieces to glue back on. Done as best as I can with them. And then I've effectively created a box out of masking tape. The extra bit of tape in the bottom, I'm sure, will be a pain in the butt to get off, but it's just going to stop the epoxy seeping down into the fret slots. Because yes, I am going to have to recut and re-clean out the fret slots, but I don't fancy sewing entirely through epoxy to do it. So that's the plan. It's actually quite cold in here at the moment, so what I've done is I have had my epoxy sitting near the shop heater, so it's a little bit warmer than the actual room is at the moment. Still probably a little bit cold than is ideal, but that's what I'm going to have to do. So I'm just going to mix up some epoxy exactly as I did before in a slightly larger quantity. So there we have our green epoxy, and I don't really have much of a method planned for this. I'm more or less just going to slap it on. So yet again, I'm having some bad luck when recording these videos. I've just lost a bit of footage. All I did was pour some of this epoxy directly on top of the fretboard and prod it with a stick a little bit. It's been warmed up, so hopefully it shouldn't have too much going on in the way of air bubbles. You can see some little bubbles working their way to the surface. I could attack it with a heat gun, but I'm a little bit scared to, because I've literally just made this box out of masking tape and nothing else. And the last thing I want to do is melt that glue while I've got epoxy running all over the place. I don't think there's any major air bubbles or anything like that in it, and I think they will actually work their way out to some extent. It's not like a clear river table where I'm really going to notice if I get little bubbles trapped in there. Hopefully when I come to sand it back, it's going to be good enough. But in other circumstances, if I wasn't happy with that, I could just get my heat gun and just lightly dust it over the top to keep it nice and thin and runny so that the air could work its way to the top. But it should be okay. So I'm just going to monitor it for about sort of 10 minutes, make sure we've got no leaks and everything looks okay, and then we'll leave it overnight again. Well, here we are, actually about a week later, and certainly feels hard. Can't see much in the way of bubbles in there. There are actually a couple of little bubbles, but I'm not too worried about that. Let's get this tape off and see what we've got. Obviously I won't be able to get all the tape off at this exact moment in time because some of it is trapped under the epoxy. So no immediate signs of disaster so far. It seems to have actually done quite well to keep it out of the fret slots. What I now need to do is try and attack it with a file and get the worst of it off. Just obviously being careful not to eat into the fretboard when I do that. It is quite thin at this end. In the centre you can just about see the ebony poking through there, but it's just thick enough to cover it. Let's get it clamped down and get the files out. Just using my inexpensive Magnuson second cut file that I used to carve most of the neck. Just experimenting, trying the more coarse rasp. So you can see I'm just starting to get through to the tape that I initially laid on top of the fretboard. So I definitely want to more or less abandon the coarse file on this side, switch to the fine file. We'll get a little bit more off and then I'll flip around and make a start on the other side. You can just about see the wood through the epoxy now. I'm just going to try and get it sort of to that point, maybe a little bit further, right away across the design, and then we'll probably have to switch to sanding. Okay, we're getting to the point where I dare not go any further with the file really, are already starting to get through to the wood in places, and I really don't want to be taking too much out of the wood. So I'm now going to switch to a radius sanding block, and hopefully it won't take me too long to get through the last of that. Well, there we have it. I don't know whether to consider it good or bad, really. Obviously, I went about this completely the wrong way. This isn't inlay, this is casting epoxy into a fretboard. And to be honest with you, the actual technique I've used here to do it hasn't been too bad. It's just, unfortunately, my technique when it came to actual operation of the Dremel was pretty poor, to be honest. And as such, the cavity that I was setting the epoxy into isn't fantastic. There's still a little bit of sanding to do. You can see where there's still some little bits of epoxy that I've sort of overlapped onto the fretboard. Hopefully when I do the final sand, they might tidy up just a little bit more. I'd be tempted, I could come back in, particularly where we've got these kind of sharp points or we've got lines that need clearing up. I could, in theory, come in with a scalpel and do a little bit of etching, which wouldn't be a bad idea, but I'm honestly just so keen to get onto the next guitar now. I've spent far too long on this first one, and we've still got the rest of the fretboard to inlay yet. So yeah, this video has taken a little while to put together just because I'm actually working away from home at the moment, and I only sort of have a couple of hours a week to work on it, and everything requires leaving stuff to set for 24 hours. So I think, although I originally planned to do the full inlay in one video, it's actually going to involve different techniques anyway. So I think we're actually going to end this video here, and I will see you in the next one. I promise I will try and make some good headway over the Christmas holidays and maybe get another video out, hopefully not too soon. I have been putting out a lot of videos on the channel more to do with electronics and things recently. I do want this channel mostly to be about guitar building. Do let me know if you find that the electronic stuff kind of gets in the way, or maybe makes you not want to stick around and subscribe to the channel. But either way, please do subscribe. Let me know what you think, and I'll try and cater to your every need. Until next time, goodbye.